Hi there. In this series, I wanted to start talking about the basics of different archetypes. So what is the theme of the archetype? What are the goals and how do they accomplish those goals? And then go over each of their cards one by one and sort of discuss how do those all fit into that big strategy. And also, hopefully, organize it in a nice visual way to kind of make it easier to digest this information. In this first video, I wanted to talk about the brand new archetype, Tearlaments, that's coming out in just a couple weeks in the new core set, Power of the Elements. So we'll start with talking about the archetype itself, what to expect when it first comes out, and then also what to expect in a few more months when they get more support, because we've seen this deck become very strong over in the OCG using all of these other cards that are going to be coming out for us in a few months. So let's get started. First of all, they're a fusion archetype. They're entirely based around getting two fusion monsters. None of their main deck monsters are intended to be sort of an end board like boss monster type thing. All of that is coming from the extra deck. They're also sort of the next step in the Visastar Frost lore that's going on in a lot of the cards, and that card does get referenced by name in some of the cards, so we will talk about that interaction at the end. As you can see from the diagram over here, the first wave of support consists of 10 cards, 4 main deck monsters, 2 fusion monsters, 1 field spell, and then 3 traps. They will be getting a second wave of support in the following core set in like 3 months, Darkwing Blast, which will then give them an extra fusion monster and 3 spells. Now, the gimmick of this deck revolves around 2 specific effects on their main deck monsters. There's one that's a little bit different and we'll talk about in a minute, but the other 3 are all very on theme, and they have 2 effects. One is an effect that's shared between them. It says if they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect, then you can perform a fusion summon. Specifically using that monster still in the graveyard, it can't have been moved elsewhere, and other materials from your hand, field, or graveyard by placing them on the bottom of the deck. And the second effect is a mill effect, where you get to send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, which will then proc your fusion effects if you manage to send a Tearlaments monster to the graveyard. It's worth noting that unlike a lot of other archetypes, it is not going to lock you into just fusion monsters or just Tearlaments monsters. You are still open to do any kind of extra deck plays that you want. So let's focus on the main deck monsters first. 3 of them play directly with that sort of strategy, that gimmick that I discussed earlier. All 3 of these are Dark Aqua monsters, levels 2, 3, and 4. The final monster is also a level 4, but this time it's a Water Warrior, and it works a bit different from the others, and we'll talk about that in a second. His effect is different, but he works really well with the other ones, helping you proc their effects. First up is Tearlaments Merlee. She's the level 2, and this is just sort of basic one. It's a Dark Aqua, 800 attack, 2000 defense. Its unique effect is just, if this card is normal or special summoned, you can send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. That's it. Just very basic. Summon it. If it comes onto the field, you get to mill. And then hopefully you mill one of the other ones, or even this, and then you can use their effect to use them both for fusion summoning. It might be worth noting that this is the only mill effect that ends up being optional of these main deck monsters. All the other ones, their mill is tied to the resolution of a different effect. I'm not sure if you'll ever find that relevant information, but it's true. The next one is Tearlaments Havnis. This is the level 3, it's still a Dark Aqua, 1600 attack, 1000 defense, and this is the one that I would say you really want to see in your hand if you're going second, because of its unique effect that says when your opponent activates a monster effect on the field, quick effect, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. So again, mill is not optional, it is tied to the resolution of that quick effect. You'll notice that just says if your opponent activates a monster effect on the field. If you're going second and you have this in your hand, you can activate this on your opponent's first turn. And there are a lot of very good fusion monsters that you might want to pull out on your opponent's first turn. And we'll talk about those after we get through the rest of the Tearlaments cards. And of course, it also has the effect to perform a fusion summon if it is sent to the graveyard by a card effect. The next one we have is Tearlaments Sharon. This is the level 4 of the Dark Aqua monsters, 1800 attack, 1300 defense. And this one's unique effect is that during your main phase, you can special summon this card from your hand. And if you do, send one monster from your hand to the graveyard, then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. So you do need one other monster in hand to be able to get this mill effect off, but if that other card in your hand is a Tearlaments monster, then you can proc that one's fusion effect by just getting this onto the field, and potentially getting more material into the graveyard for fusion summons. And of course, this one also has the effect that when it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can perform that fusion summon. Finally, for the main deck monsters, we have Tearlaments Rhinohart. He is the level 4 Water Warrior with 1500 attack and 2100 defense. And he also has two effects that sort of mirror the other ones. He also will send something from the deck to the graveyard, and he also has an effect that triggers if he is sent to the graveyard by a card effect. So this says, if this card is normal or special summoned, you can send one Tearlaments monster from your deck to the graveyard, except Tearlaments Rhinohart. So instantly, if you summon Tearlaments Rhinohart, you are able to send one of the other ones to the graveyard to trigger its graveyard fusion effect. So this is an excellent starter card. Just instantly summon him, you get one of your fusion monsters. Now for his graveyard effect, it says, if this card is sent to the graveyard by card effect, you can special summon this card, but banish it when it leaves the field, and if you do, send one Tearlaments card from your hand to the graveyard. You can only use each effect once per turn. Now, it's important to note that that said card, not monster. And we'll see in a little bit, the trap cards also have the same sort of setup, where they have one main effect and one effect that activates when they're sent to the graveyard by card effect. And we'll see what that gives us access to in a little bit. So what we see is Rhinohart acts as both a starter to send one of our monsters from the deck to the graveyard, and an extender. When he himself is sent to the graveyard, he'll hop onto the field and then let us send a card from our hand to the graveyard to then activate one of those effects if we had one in hand. Now let's look at what the payoff is. What do we get for all of this trouble we're going through to get these fusion monsters on board? So the first of our two fusion monsters is Tearlaments Kikalos. It is a level 5 Dark Aqua with 2300 attack and 1200 defense. Its requirements are one Tearlaments monster and one Aqua monster. So if you manage to summon Rhinohart, instantly you can go into this. Assuming all the effects resolve, he will take the place of the Tearlaments monster, and the only other monsters that you're allowed to send to the graveyard from the deck are all Aqua monsters. Now what does this do? If this card is special summoned, you can take one Tearlaments card from your deck and either add it to your hand or send it to the graveyard. So again, you can instantly proc one of the sent to graveyard effects, or if you just need more cards in hand, you can add it to your hand instead. And luckily, the fusion effects, you can use cards from hand or graveyard, so there's no real downside to adding it to your hand or something like that. You're not going to lose out on having material. The only thing that you don't get is the graveyard effect from the card. Also, this card has a second effect. You can target one monster you control, special summon one Tearlaments monster from your hand or graveyard, and if you do, send the targeted monster to the graveyard. This, of course, is an effect that will send to the graveyard, so you can use this to proc any of your fusion effects. Of course, this card can also target itself to send to the graveyard, and finally, if this card is sent to the graveyard by card effect, you can send the top 5 cards of your deck to the graveyard. And everything's a hard once per turn. So this so far is the biggest mill effect that we can get from this deck. So far everything has been either send one specific card, mill 3, and now we have a mill 5. Now the final fusion monster is Tearlaments Rhinohart. This is a level 9 Dark Fiend monster, 3000 attack, 3000 defense, and its requirements are Tearlaments Rhinohart specifically, and then 2 Aqua monsters. So this so far has the most difficult condition to meet for summoning it, so let's see what we get for using all of these resources. First, it cannot be used as fusion material, which is great anytime Branded is going around or anything that might be using Super Poly. Second, if this card is special summoned, or if an Aqua monster is sent to the graveyard by a card effect while this card is on the field, you can target one card your opponent controls and shuffle it into the deck, which is one of the best forms of removal. And finally, of course, he has his own effect that activates when he's sent to the graveyard by a card effect. And that effect says, you can special summon this card, and if you do, send one Tearlaments card from your deck to the graveyard. So instantly, you can special summon it right back, and then send a Tearlaments card from the deck to the graveyard to presumably do more fusion summoning. Or, again, it's card, not monster, so we can get one of the graveyard effects from one of the trap cards. So Tearlaments Rhinohart is a super cool boss monster for this archetype. He has a ton of internal synergy with his own effects, and also he works really well with all of the other cards in the archetype so far. It's also worth noting that it's not quite as hard to fusion summon as a lot of other 3 material fusion monsters are. Because remember, Rhinohart sends another monster to the graveyard, so you immediately get to activate their trigger effect to fusion summon using that monster. So if you just have one other Aqua monster in your hand, you can immediately go into Tearlaments Rhinohart. Now let's look at the field spell. In this first wave of support, it is the only spell, so let's see what it does. It's called Primeval Planet Perlerino. So notice it does not have Tearlaments in the name, so you cannot send it to the graveyard using your other effects. But unlike all of the other cards, it does not have an effect when it is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, so you really don't want to send it anyway. So first, when this card is activated, you can add one Tearlaments monster or Visastar Frost from your deck to your hand. So that's the first time Visastar Frost has come up. He'll come up on all of the trap cards too. But this acts as a searcher for any of your Tearlaments monsters or that guy. Second, fusion monsters and Tearlaments monsters you control gain 500 attack. So all your main deck Tearlaments plus any fusion monster that you have. And the final effect of this field spell says, if a Tearlaments monster you control or in your graveyard is shuffled into the deck or extra deck, except relating to the damage step, you can target one card on the field, destroy it. So once per turn, when you're doing your fusion summon using the graveyard effect, you'll get to just destroy one card on the field. So this field spell does a lot for us. It searches a monster, gives a nice little attack boost, and also it gives us extra removal just for doing what we were already going to be doing with our monsters. Now I know here it says shuffled into the deck. Technically our monsters just placed on the bottom of the deck that has already been cleared up. There should be something on the screen right now showing a comment referencing the fact that not only have they explicitly said that this will still proc that effect, but citing a specific ruling from the past where returning it to the deck and shuffling it into the deck are considered the exact same thing. So now let's talk about the trap cards. There are three of them: a normal trap, a continuous trap, and a counter trap. And they all sort of have this shared requirement that you control a Tearlaments monster or Visastar Frost. Also, as we mentioned earlier, they all have two effects. One is their sort of trap card effect, and the second is an effect that activates when they are sent to the graveyard by a card effect. So let's start with the normal trap, called Tearlaments Meta Noise. This says, if you control a Tearlaments monster or Visastar Frost, target one face-up monster your opponent controls, change it to face-down defense position, then send one Tearlaments monster from your deck to the graveyard. So it's a trap card, Book of Moon, basically. Plus, you get to send something from the deck to the graveyard to, on your opponent's turn, continue to activate your fusion effects. Second, if this card is sent to the graveyard by card effect, you can target one Tearlaments monster in your graveyard and add it to your hand. So what this effectively does is turn one of your effects that lets you send one of the trap cards from deck to graveyard into an effect that just adds one of your monsters back to your hand. Now let's talk about the continuous trap, Tearlaments Sleek. This says, if you control a Tearlaments monster or Visastar Frost, you can target one effect monster your opponent controls, negate its effects, then send one monster you control to the graveyard. Also, Tearlaments Sleek says, if this card is sent to the graveyard by card effect, you can add one Tearlaments monster from your deck to your hand. So similar to Meta Noise, this card can turn any of your generic sended Tearlaments card from the deck to the graveyard into a generic search for a Tearlaments monster from your deck. And finally, we have Tearlaments Crime, the counter trap. This says that when a spell or trap card or monster effect is activated, while you control a Tearlaments monster or Visastar Frost, negate the activation, and if you do, shuffle that card into the deck. Then send one monster from your hand to the graveyard. This of course will pair really well with having a Rhinohart in hand that will proc its effect to special summon itself, which will then proc its other effect to dump a different Tearlaments monster from the deck to the graveyard to then perform a fusion summon again on your opponent's turn. And at the bare minimum right then, you'll have the materials to make Kit Kalos. And Tearlaments Crime's final effect says, if this card is sent to the graveyard by card effect, you can target one of your banished Tearlaments monsters and add it to your hand. Hopefully, the only thing that's getting banished is Rhinohart. That is the only card in this strategy that banishes itself, but because our fusion effects require us to use the monster activating the effect as material, and it has to still be in the graveyard, this deck is a target for things like DD Crow or a lot of the Exo-Sister effects, where you're going to be a magnet for graveyard banishing. So this could be a good way to get some of that back if you find that while you're playing against people, a lot of your stuff is getting banished. Now we should talk about Visastar Frost. He was mentioned 4 different times in these card effects, so we should at least cover what he does and sort of talk about whether or not it would actually fit into the strategy. So Visastar Frost is a level 6 light warrior tuner with 2100 attack and 1500 defense. And his effect is, if this card is in your hand, you can target one monster you control with a different type and attribute than this card. Destroy that monster as effect, and if you do, special summon this card. And then it has an effect that when this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can make this card gain attack equal to half the original attack or defense of that monster, whichever is higher. Your choice if tied. That battle effect is obviously way less relevant. What's interesting is the destruction effect. The way he gets himself on board is by destroying one of your monsters as effect. So right off the bat, he can proc our graveyard fusion effects. So it is promising. Right now the thing is, so can a lot of our other cards. Why would we play this over something else? Biggest thing that I see that he gives us is the fact that he is a high-level tuner. There are a lot of very good high-level synchro monsters. The rest of our deck doesn't have any tuners, so potentially that could be something really good. So let's kind of take a look at that. So when we look at the archetype, we actually have a nice variety of levels to play with. Our main deck monsters are 2, 3, and 4, and we also have a 5 in the extra deck. So that gives us access to synchro monsters level 8 through 11, which is most of the very strong ones. Our other fusion monster is already level 9, and unfortunately there are no level 15 synchro monsters, so that one's out. So let's take a look at how we would potentially make these level 8 through 11 synchro monsters. When we're getting Visastar Frost on board, we're destroying a monster, which will proc its graveyard fusion effect. If we have access to any other Tearlaments monster at that time for material, we could instantly go into Kit Kalos, and then we have a level 5 on board. That'll give us access to a level 11 synchro. For example, here we have Psychic and Punisher, a very strong new level 11 synchro. That overall isn't the worst synergy there. It does require that we have both 2 Tearlaments and also access to Visastar Frost. So that's like a 3-card combo. 2 of them are generic, so like not unlikely to have them, but it's not going to be like a super consistent first turn type combo. It does end on a pretty strong monster, but not nearly consistent enough to be a super competitive play. The thing that would have made Visastar Frost a definite include for me at least was Rhinohart. The fact that when he's destroyed, he special summons himself, so he gets a body on board. A level 6 tuner plus level 4 is level 10. That's a very short play to get Baron de Fleur out. That's even faster than Sword Soul would get that out if they went through the level 8 synchro first. But that doesn't work, because they're both warrior monsters. If Rhinohart was anything but a warrior, this would have been awesome. Fortunately, he's not. Obviously, you still can use the 2 of them to go into Baron, but it's not nearly as simple as just special summoning Visastar Frost by destroying Rhinohart. You also have Sharon, who can special summon herself, so both of our level 4s do have the ability to special summon themselves, and so does Visastar Frost, but again, it's not a crazy consistent, definite first turn play that you're going to be able to do more often than not, so it's like still not the best. So overall, I would say that Visastar Frost is definitely not going to be in any super competitive build of this deck. He's also not like the worst include ever. It's just that the combos with him are going to be a little bit too inconsistent and require just a few too many cards to do each time. All right, now let's start to look at some of the really good synergy. Some things that you're almost definitely going to see when you're playing against this deck. The first one I want to talk about is El Shadal Winda. This is one of the strongest monster floodgates in the game, and it will be super easy for this deck to make, especially considering the synergy with the main deck Shadal monsters. Since we're doing a lot of milling for effect, we could very easily get the strong sent to graveyard effects from the Shadal monsters and then fuse with them. And this is why whether you're playing this deck or playing against it, you want to look out for the level 3 Tearlaments main deck monster. That's the one that quick effect, when your opponent activates a monster effect, you get to special summon it and then mill 3. If the person milling those 3 cards already has a Shadal monster in hand or mills one, so that would mean that a Shadal monster was anywhere in the top 8 cards of their deck, since they're going second and they haven't drawn yet or anything. And it does also require that they end up milling another Tearlaments monster, because Tearlaments Hovness is only going to put itself on the board. It's not actually going to perform the fusion summon, but if they get that mill, you're going to be hit with a powerful floodgate on your first turn, and you probably don't have a hand full of like going second destruction cards. Based on what we just described, it's not going to be the most common thing, but it takes up just a few spaces in the deck, and it is insanely powerful when it goes off, so a lot of people are probably going to have Winda in the extra deck. So sort of in a similar vein, Predator Plant monsters are very powerful fusion monsters that you might need to look out for. In particular, Predator Plant Dracostapelia, it only requires a fusion monster and a dark monster, something that this deck on its own has a lot of access to. Right off the bat, once that gets summoned, which will negate its effects, also it'll become level 1 for as long as it has that predator counter on it. So if you are playing any strategy that requires Xyz summoning, or very specific synchro summoning, or just any specific level at all, like both Exosister and Sprite do, this could hurt you quite a bit. Also, leaning into the fact that these materials are fairly generic, just a fusion and a dark monster, you might need to look out for Super Poly. If you're playing a dark monster or in a fusion strategy, it's going to hurt real bad to get hit with the Super Poly that can then negate an effect, and also reduce a monster's level to 1. Dracostapelia specifically is a monster that this deck can very easily make all on its own, or can use your monsters to do it if they get the chance. So that's something else to look out for. Leaning into that, really any generic super poly target, like Mud Dragon of the Swamp. There's a new world premiere, very good super poly target coming out in Power of the Elements also, so that might be something to look out for too. Following that specific strategy one step further, Mud Dragon of the Swamp is a level 4 water monster, so is Rhinohart. So between the two of those, it is possible to make Bahamut Shark, which can then instantly bring out Totally Awesome. This won't be all that common. If they aren't playing Mud Dragon of the Swamp, then the only way to make Bahamut Shark would be to use 2 Rhinohearts. One thing to note with this is that if you've already used Rhinoheart's ability to special summon itself, it is in danger of being banished when it leaves the field. But if it becomes Xyz material before leaving the field, the game state will just forget all about that. So when you detach to Summon Toad, I guess in this case, Rhinoheart won't get banished. It'll just go to the graveyard normally. Also, if you didn't use the special summon effect, if it just was on the field already, it will not proc his special summon effect because Bahamut Shark detaches for cost, not effect. So it is not being sent to the graveyard by a card effect. Now there are some Xyz monsters that do detach for effect and not cost, which I believe will then count as being sent to graveyard for effect. One interesting one that I kind of came across is Outer Entity Nyarla, a level 4 Earth Fiend, 0 attack, 2600 defense. When this card is Xyz summoned, you can discard any number of cards, increase this card's rank by the number of cards discarded. That's useless. It's discarding for cost, so that's not actually going to help us. The cool thing is, once per turn, while this card has Xyz material, you can target one monster in your graveyard. Detach all materials from this card, and if you do, attach that target to this card as material. So first of all, you're detaching for effect. So if you have a Sharon and a Rhinohart attached to this, you're sending them both. If you haven't used their effects this turn, you will be able to proc the special summon and the fusion summon. But what makes this one card even a little bit better is the final effect. When a monster is attached by this effect, this card's type and attribute become the same as that monster's original type and attribute. So if you're attaching one of your other main deck Tearlaments monsters, you can make this into a Dark Aqua monster, which means you then have an Aqua monster to use for the fusion summon. And if you did have Sharon, Rhinohart as one of those materials, and then this, you can now go straight into Kaleidoheart. I'm not going to say that this is like a good strategy. There are only sort of 2 cases where this comes up. One is you are already doing so well that you just have a bunch of extra material sitting around, in which case you don't need to extend like this anymore. You probably already have a Kaleidoheart on board anyway. Or it's going so poorly that you have just a bunch of material sitting around that got negated, I guess, and they weren't able to activate their effects. So they're just sort of sitting in graveyard, because you need 1 in the graveyard and then 2 on board to make this. 1 in the graveyard to attach this material to make it an aqua. So it's not like the best. I just kind of wanted to bring it up as an example of some Xyz monsters do detach for effect. And this was just kind of a neat one that I saw, so I figured I'd bring it up. It is worth paying attention in the future to other Xyz monsters that might sort of detach for effect instead of a cost, especially if they're also able to reattach things to themselves as material. I don't think this one's that great, but there could be something in the future that does work better. So that's pretty much it as far as Tearlaments cards go. There's one more really big thing to look out for the future. It won't come out until later this year, but there's a set that will release a bunch of cards that are thematically based on the cards played by the Ishizu Ishtar character from the anime, and a lot of them have effects that let you mill 5. Boost the consistency of this deck wildly. The more you can mill, the more you can fusion summon, put the cards right back into the deck. So you don't really need to worry about running out of cards. It is incredibly strong. So that's the basics of Tearlaments. I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know down below in the comments if there's anything you think I missed. If you have any other builds to this deck that you're looking at. I know a lot of people are playing a lot of the Lightsworn cards because they also mill cards. So yeah, thanks for watching and have a nice day.